Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Muñiz.
Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast. I am one of your hosts, Phil Hawkins, the MCAT director here at Jack Westin, and a person who's been to med school, here with...
My name is Azaii Muñiz. I'm currently in medical school, second year, and really excited to continue this podcast. We've really enjoyed getting to chat with you guys about topics that we had difficulty with, so you don't make the same mistakes, things that we've learned along the way, both teaching for Jack Westin, right, as part of the company, also just in general, our experience with the MCAT. We've been teaching for a little bit. And then in our cases, also what we've learned starting medical school, Phil having done medical school, myself being in it, and trying to incorporate that so that you guys can get a holistic taste of all things MCAT related.
Yeah. And it's something that I have such strong thoughts about. I sit and think about the MCAT like every day, pretty much. At some point, I'm thinking about what's going on with the MCAT or an MCAT topic for a decade. And so over time, you start to develop opinions. And I really love this podcast gives us an ability to okay, I have some very strong thoughts on this and how things could be better and help you guys avoid some of the pitfalls that we've come across. But I do want to do a quick shout out. If you guys have any comments, if you're listening to this on YouTube, feel free to drop some comments, what things you would like to hear more about, or anything else, anything along the MCAT journey. If you're liking it, if you feel like we should be talking less about something or more about something else, please let us know, because we're definitely open to feedback. But all that spiel out of the way. Today we're talking about the bio section, which I know I talked about how last time Chem Phys was my favorite. Bio is maybe my least favorite. Turns out biology is really big in medicine. Who knew? So it seems like, Azaii, we have an opposite viewpoint of me there.
Yeah. So anyone who's heard me talk, cars is probably my favorite, but biochem comes very close second. Maybe that's why I'm in medical school, questionable. But no, I think that it's one of the sections where, and I guess I'll start us off on this. It's a little bit of everything, right? So last time we talked about how Chem Phys was a little bit of every topic. I think biochem is a little bit more of every style, in the sense that there are some things that you do have to memorize. There are concepts that you need to have really strong foundations for. There's a lot of building on topics as you learn more about them. So it's like the jack of all trades. Haha. But no, it's a really great section. I think that it also can be really tough because, and Phil, we were just talking about this, there are some parts about the biochem section that can feel pretty unfair. You're seeing a lot of things that you haven't necessarily seen before. People have I would say even more varying exposures to some of the material that's tested in this section. But it's really going to force you to put that thinking cap on, work that brain. So if you don't feel a little bit tired by the time you finish biochem, let me know your secrets, because even in medical school, there are times where my brain is a little bit tired after going through what feels like a biochem section during a course.
Yeah, and you're right. There are a lot of different things going on in the bio section. There is, I feel like, more memorization with biology, which, to be honest, is probably why it was my least favorite, because I am inherently lazy. I want to teach me an equation that I can apply to 10,000 scenarios rather than make me memorize 40 things. And so when it comes to the MCAT, there's a lot of stuff that you do need to memorize, like amino acids, hormones, what's going on in the digestive tract, the path of blood in the circulatory system. A lot of those things you just kind of have to memorize overall. And that is something that can be a little bit of a challenge because it is quite a volume. However, I don't think that is the biggest challenge most students have in the bio section. Very often the biggest challenge bio students have is just the data interpretation, which is what we're talking about with it being kind of unfair. You can graduate undergrad with a biology degree. And remember, you don't have to have a bio degree to take the MCAT, right? I know a guy that has a degree in evolutionary linguistics. He's a physician, and that was his bachelor's degree. So he just studied language. And so somebody who is studying biology in their undergrad has more exposure to biology than even the average MCAT student. Those students still have not been exposed to the level of biology that's showing up in the MCAT, especially in the way the passages show up. Journal articles on the MCAT, the first time a student looks at them, they always feel overwhelmed. And that's partially by design. The MCAT writers are throwing things at you that they know you've never seen before, like new techniques and new like diseases and new hormone interactions and drug interactions that they know you've never seen before. It's like if you finish a bio section and you have already known about every protein or drug that they talked about on the test, like that would be miraculous. Nobody knows all the things that they're going to talk about on the MCAT. And I don't mean like just because it's, you know, nobody is like studying well, but like nobody is supposed to. So the MCAT writers present all of this data at you and they throw it all at you in this like big pile. And like, if you have not been doing like, if you've been a PhD for 10 years and you've been writing journal articles, it's going to feel fine to you. If you are not that person, then you're going to look at those journal articles and you're going to be like, what is going on here? What's going on with these experiments? Because they are like, they're very dense. It's very hard to read. And so learning to deal with that is a huge challenge on the MCAT, separate from just memorizing all the stuff that you need to memorize. And so that the memorization stuff is something that is, I think, a little bit more on the bio section. There is a fair amount of that in the psych soc as well. But like, I think what separates the bio section from all the others is just the level of data interpretation, the level of the journal articles and the readings and things to pull. And so I think that's what separates that from everything else.
Yeah. I just want to touch base on a few things with the memorization before hopping over back to the data interpretation. This comes from both studying as a pre-med and as a med student. When you have to sit down and memorize, for example, a bunch of hormones, some students will do really well with flashcards. However, there are many of us who are not, our minds don't do well with flashcards, being very frank. So something that I have found really helpful and that I've passed on to my students over the last few years and that I use in medical school and I'm constantly adapting is trying to make a story out of it. So for example, thinking about the well, let me back up. I said hormones first. So with the hormones, something that I did while studying for the MCAT that was really helpful was I made a very crude map of a human being, right? So just general circle of a head, square of a body, not an artist. Feel free to make it really nice if you're artistically inclined. And then I actually drew an arrow to the major organs that were producing the hormones, right? So hypothalamus, posterior pituitary, anterior pituitary, etc. Wrote down the hormones and then what they did. And once I had that sheet down, I created a little bit of a story. Okay, so if the calcium levels change, right, which hormones would change in response to that? If the blood pressure changes, right, which hormones are being released and how are they responding? And I found that really helpful. Similarly for the digestive system, just because this is an organ system that rarely gets any love until you get to medical school. And then there's a whole, you're
going to spend weeks on it.
Yeah, spent weeks on it. So I found it really helpful when studying for the MCAT, and then for medical school, things change a little bit. But for the MCAT, imagine that you are the cheeseburger. And that was just because that was the example that was given at one point. But you are the cheeseburger. What's happening to you at each of these different stages, right? So what enzymes are at play in the mouth versus in the stomach? What is being broken down versus absorbed, right? The difference between those two and how they differ in the stomach versus the small intestine. What's being released from the pancreas that is going to affect you as the cheeseburger, whatever you're eating. Maybe it's a Beyond Burger. How is it affecting you, right, as you go through? By the time you get to the brush border, right, what's left of you and how are you being transported? So those little stories can make it a little bit easier just to kind of get through that memorization if you're not someone that's super, memorization inclined. With respect to the data interpretation, yes. So I was a Spanish literature major. However, I was really lucky in that the undergrad program that I attended had a set of courses for non-biology pre-med majors. And so one of the things that they knew that we would need is to learn to read some of those science, journal articles that we weren't getting exposure to in any of our other courses, right? Because as much as I love, Spanish language and literature and, reading, I had a name in my head, but I was like, that's not relevant to this. It's not going to help me when it comes time to analyze journal articles and determine whether the science is sound, whether the research is sound, what the results are actually saying. And so most people don't have courses that are designed with that in mind. And so, like Phil said, that can be really unfair for folks who, and feel really unfair for folks who are coming in that don't have that very, super strong bio background. And so something that I recommend to students, and that one of my, I also worked in a lab, and that my PI suggested, was read a scientific, article on something that you're not interested in. And then sit down and really break it down and say, okay, I don't have all of, I don't know what reagent this was and that's mentioned in the methods, but do I really need that to understand the overarching idea? Do I really need that to understand, what the results are saying? So learning to parse out what is critical to understand the results and what's not critical, right? But can be supplemental if you happen to have more background with it, or, more background understanding it. That can be a really great first step, right, to making sure that you get more comfortable with these really uncomfortable articles and pieces. Like Phil said, you are probably going to sit down and read a passage on testing. You're going to be like, what did I just read?
Mhm.
How am I supposed to understand this? I don't know anything about this disease. I barely remember the content that I was supposed to study regarding this organ system or whatever it may be. So getting used to that discomfort, but also knowing what's worth being uncomfortable about, can be really helpful for this section and easing the nerves, because I will be the first to tell you that it's really easy to get nervous during a test. And as we've talked about, you do not want to be so nervous and stressed that you get a brain fart, right?
Yeah, just like blank.
Exactly. And so honestly, right, it's making sure that there's a balance. You're balancing memorizing some of the content, usually not the most difficult part for most students. You're balancing exposure to diseases, disorders, lab techniques that are very unfamiliar, and being comfortable with the discomfort, but also recognizing what's important while you're uncomfortable. And then there's also the actual data interpretation, the figures, the tables. This is a little bit more nitty gritty, but something that I've noticed a lot of students forget to do is read figure names, descriptions, titles, legends. All of that stuff can be super helpful. I can visualize at least 2 or 3 either figures or tables that I have seen on MCAT Passages that at the bottom say, oh, this, the data or this line on the graph is not important or not relevant. Or, they'll tell you what's statistically significant, even though you have no other way of knowing except for the little asterisk, right? So they will orient you as to what's most important, because they know that these can be super overwhelming, that the way that the data are presented can be very foreign for a lot of people. So letting those tidbits guide you can also be a great way to ease some of the stress and just be a little bit more successful on this otherwise hectic section.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely like several questions from the AAMC that I've seen. Like the answer is just in the explanation, like for the figure. And so you got to pay attention to those. And like the axes, what are they labeled? A lot of times you can get answers just by kind of like focusing in on those things. But there's kind of a lot of things going on here. And so we're trying to tell you like ways to make it a little bit less overwhelming, a little bit less stressful. But it's gonna be overwhelming. Like the normal response to looking at a passage in the bio section is what? Like, what are they talking? What is it? What's going on here? That's the normal experience, especially at the beginning. And this is why we say it's like a little bit unfair, because there are things that they're throwing at you. But to be honest, once again, I think that they're doing this on purpose for a couple of reasons. First off, as a physician, you need to be able to deal with things that you are not expected. If you are thrown in the deep end, all of a sudden somebody's bleeding in front of you and like you aren't even in the hospital, you can't just like shut down because you don't have all the tools and all the knowledge that you normally have. Like normally I'd like to run an EKG on this guy, but he's on the sidewalk here. I can't run an EKG. And so you need to be able to deal with the scenario that you're in. And so I think that that's actually an important skill that the MCAT is subconsciously trying to test. Like, can you deal with unexpected stuff? So if you are not ready for this, so you're kind of supposed to be not ready. So that's actually a thing that is very uncomfortable for a lot of students, being shoved in those scenarios. The second thing, like they could do a lot of stuff that like unexpected, but why the data interpretation? Why does that need to be unexpected? Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be the data interpretation that's unexpected, but you do have to be good at data interpretation as a physician. You are only really good at data interpretation if you've like read like 50 or 100 journal articles and really dissected them. And most students haven't done that, even if they have like a bio degree. I feel like I got a bio degree and I looked at like 3 or 4 journal articles, which is kind of an embarrassment that I was able to like get so far in my career without actually understanding like research, or like reading other people's research. So a lot of students get to this point, like get to the MCAT, and they are not great at interpreting data. You have to be great as a physician because your education doesn't stop when you graduate med school and like you start practicing. All the doctors I knew, like when I was in med school, I'm dating myself here a little bit, but the hepatitis C vaccine or cure came out when I was in med school. So every doctor I knew was reading up on this. So they're reading the journal articles. They're going through that. When you're a physician, like pharmaceutical sales reps are going to come to you and like say, like, you should use our drug. Here's all the data on it. And I don't mean to imply that they are like anything bad about pharmaceutical sales reps, but they get paid to like when you use their drugs. A lot of times their drugs are awesome, but you need to be able to look at the data yourself and not be convinced by a salesman to say like, okay, this is like a very valuable drug. This would be really useful for my one patient Bob, but not good for patient Steve, because it seems like there's some side effects here with respiratory stuff, and patient Steve's got some weird respiratory stuff. So I probably don't want to give them that drug, but Bob, this would be great for. And so you need to be able to like dive into the data and understand the implications. So you have to be good at this as a physician. Everyone's bad at it in undergrad. So the logical thing is like, let's teach them to do this in med school. Azaii, you would probably agree that you probably don't need more stuff to learn in med school. I know, at least for me, I'm like, no, like you cannot add any more information for me to shove in my head. Mm-hmm. So what the AAMC does is they put this all on the MCAT. So because they don't have time to teach you in med school and you have to be good at it later and you don't get it before, they're just throwing it at you now. And so you have to be good at doing this data interpretation to do well in the MCAT. So you will be good at data interpretation later on as a physician. That's a little bit unfair because there's no step of this where anybody is teaching you this, which is why like the MCAT takes like months to really thoroughly prepare for, because you have to teach yourself new, not just knowledge, but skills like interpreting data and things like that. And that is very much a skill. And skills only really get better with exposure, which is why you have to see lots of passages and improve on those.
Yeah. Just because every so often we throw in a psych-soc term, thinking about making sure that, or the idea of interpreting a message based off of its merits versus how flashy it is or who's necessarily sharing the message. Yeah. That's the difference between central route of processing and peripheral route. So we want you to use central route of processing, interpret the message on its own merits when you're looking at these passages. No, but in all seriousness, it is something
I thought you were talking about the pharmaceutical sales reps and being like,
yeah, so
like, they're really attractive. Don't use the drug just because it's like a very attractive person convincing you.
Yeah. So, and you think about the person there. I was thinking about just like the flashiness of it all. But yes, the idea here, right, is that there's a lot that's overwhelming. There's a lot that is difficult that you're not familiar with. That said, right, you can still break down even the toughest of research methods and experiments, right? So something that I like to tell my students and something that I have found helpful for myself is have questions that you ask yourself and use those as a benchmark for whether you're really understanding the basics of what's happening. So the first thing is I'll ask myself some iteration of what's the question that the researchers are trying to answer? Because if I can't figure out what they're trying to figure out, right, what actually matters to them, my interpretation of the rest of the passage, the rest of the data, et cetera, is going to be really off base. It's going to be really skewed, and I'm just going to struggle. So having that general rephrase readily accessible, super helpful. And I'll work through an example in a moment. I'll try and go through this a little bit faster because I know I talk a lot. The second thing is, what did they change, right, or manipulate? How and why? right? So you're hinting at the difference between the dependent versus independent variables. You're hinting at what made the independent variable special enough to measure. That's a question that they like to ask quite a bit on the biochem section, right? Why did the researchers measure whatever protein in the cell, et cetera? And then what are the results? So in layman's terms, right? What are you seeing? What are the data telling you? And then I also like to incorporate figures, tables as kind of the fourth question I ask myself, just because those tend to get skipped over. But I think that a lot of questions are based off of the tables and figures, and they don't always send you back explicitly to a table and a figure. So having some general idea of what's on that, or what information is presented in a table or a figure, can be really helpful. So for example, let's say that I'm interested in, so what makes blood, I was going to say not pink, red. I have a pink drink on my desk. What makes blood red? And the researchers, so that's their question. And they decided to measure the amount of red blood cells, right? Just because that's the first word that comes to mind. So one of the questions you might get is, why did they measure the red blood cells in the blood, right? So right there you have, by answering the question, right, what they're interested in, becomes clear why they're measuring the red blood cells, right? The data might include the amount of red blood cells in different, samples of blood. And then they might ask you to relate. There might be a fourth question, right, on the MCAT that says, okay, based off of the results in the table, right, that showed a positive correlation between red blood cells and hue, what would you expect with this if you had a sample that was low in red blood cells, whatever it may be? So those are all different ways that the MCAT can, that was a very, very crude example, but the idea remains the same, right? They can ask you about the same information, right? The same relationship, whatever it may be, between red blood cells and how red blood looks, right? And then they can ask you that in different ways, but it's all valid. It's all different ways of interpreting the data. And so getting comfortable with each aspect of the research can be helpful to help you tackle the data interpretation from different angles, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I worry, there's a good chance that when we start talking about this, students will glaze over because they're I don't understand what's going on. And I don't understand what these things are, how they're interacting. And that happens during test day as well. And there's a lot of students that understand everything they need to know, but then they see this passage and this question, and it's so confusing and overwhelming that they kind of just throw up their hands and say I can't do this. And they just kind of give up in a way. If you had a question and a passage, let's say the question was, how is combristatin going to affect the MyoD delta E9 mutations dysregulation of the JAK-STAT pathway? And a lot of students are going to be I have no idea. Or let's say the question was, how would you test this, this combristatin's effect on this? A lot of students are going to be well, I have no idea. But if I asked you, how would you figure out if basketball shoes make you a better basketball player? Everyone's well, I'd play basketball with shoes on. I'd play basketball without shoes on and see when I did better. I'm yeah, same thing. So you take this MyoD delta E9 mutant, some of these people you'd give combristatin to, some you wouldn't. And then you just look, right? And see which one's better. And that, so many students will see a question like that and their brain will immediately shut down because I don't know about these mutations and these drugs and these hormones and this cascade. I'm completely over my head. But you don't need to know about that. What they're asking you is about the scientific reasoning. And so they're purposely trying to throw you in over your head, as we mentioned before, kind of in this, I'm uncomfortable. This wasn't what I expected. I don't know a lot about this. And just see how well you can, okay, well, let's just take what I can do and see what I can figure out from this. And that's very hard. I know when I make the question about basketball shoes and playing basketball, it's really obvious. Everyone's this is something I do with students all the time. I'll ask them a question and all the it's a room full of 30 students and they're all I don't know. And I'm all right, let's ask this question. Let's do the basketball shoes. How would you figure out if that makes you better or worse at basketball? And everyone immediately jumps to it. I'm okay, well, this is the same thing, right? If you want to see how this affects something, do it with it, do it without it, see what happens. And that's such a simple idea, but students get overwhelmed by all of the stuff going on, and it's designed to be overwhelming, and so it's a little bit unfair, but that's something that is important to realize, and just kind of like take the basics and like the reasoning. The other thing is, the more of these passages you see, like the easier it gets. And like the first ones you see are going to be very difficult, but the more you see, the easier it gets, because like science writing is another type of writing. It's like reading something in old English, right? Like if you try to do that, it's like really, really difficult, right? To kind of like read English. I mean, it's still English, but it's not how I'm used to thinking and reading. And so it's just more difficult. I have a story about trying to read a Dickens novel that is very related to this, but I won't jump into that now. But like, it's kind of a similar thing. Like trying to read a science journal article is just very difficult, because even though it's in English, it's kind of written in a different way. And that's something that most students are not doing like on their own. Like students, like if I like read Harry Potter for fun, I'm not reading like this Delta MyoDE9 mutant, right? Like I'm not reading a journal article about that. And so students have to relearn how to read those kinds of articles and how to process them. And at first it's always going to be bad, but you need to make sure that you are reviewing them. And like, you need to make sure that at least in hindsight, you understand everything that was going on in this passage. Now, like on a practice exam or something like that, you might be a little bit overwhelmed, but when you review, go back and look at that. I know we talked about that a fair amount in our like how to review a full length episode that was like, I think a couple of weeks ago. And that's like a big thing overall. And I know that we're talking about the bio section, but this stuff of like dealing with the data interpretation, it's the worst in the bio section. But there's still a lot of it in the Chem Phys and in the Psych Soc. And so like working on this, like if somebody's struggling with this data interpretation, it tends to affect the bio section more than the others, but it will affect the others as well. Every section except for cars, because there's not a lot of data interpretation in cars.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And this, like you mentioned in a couple weeks ago, we talked about how to review a full length, and we talked about determining why you're missing questions in each section. This is where those full length reviews, when you get to them, can be super helpful to narrow down what your problem area really is. A really quick note on, students who might be thinking, well, Phil, you're not with me to rephrase the questions, right? So how am I supposed to do that? Something that I think can be really helpful for some students is, for example, pathways or passages with a lot of gene names in them that are really tough. Replace it with an A, B, or C, right? And say, okay, so if gene A does this and its product inhibits gene B, right? And then gene B stimulates gene C, what happens, the translation of, or the transcription of gene C, right? What happens if I decrease the transcription of gene A or something like that? It'll simplify it as you're first getting used to the way that the MCAT is presenting the information, as you get used to the way that journal articles and scientific articles write the information that, and also present the information that that you're going to be working through. Find ways to simplify it yourself. And that way, by the time you get to questions about the data, right, questions about the research, you already have such a clean schematic in your mind that the questions become a lot easier, right? Now, granted, don't rewrite an entire passage with A, B's, and C's, but the idea remains the same. It's also something that you can do with a lot of different topics in biochem, I'd say. And so try it out. If you're really struggling with interpreting the passages, try and simplify the passages before you try and simplify the questions, and see if that makes a difference. And if it does, then, keep moving forward, keep practicing. Like we said, the practice is really the best way to get used to this style that you might not otherwise be used to. But finding something that works is golden. And so if that means working on the passage instead of immediately jumping to tackling the questions or changing how you tackle the questions, go for it. Try it out.
Yeah, I do the same thing, only instead of like A, B, and C, I actually give them names. It's like protein Bob phosphorylates Steve, which turns him on. And like, it's kind of like a weird, and actually now that I say that, that sounds a little strange. But like, that's sort of just like naming, like giving them names instead of like, like a big pile of letters. Like that's hard. I call those passages avalanches of jargon, where it's just like this whole passage is just piles of like, the STPLN4 mutation of the XKY, which was tested in the ABC cell line of this like specific species of Xenopus, whatever. And it's like that's just like hard to read because none of these are words. They're all like piles of letters. And Xenopus is maybe a word, but it's Latin, so that doesn't count. And so that's something to be aware of is like rephrasing it in ways that make sense. I also I don't take notes as much in the Chem Phys as I do in other sections, or in the bio as I do in some of the other sections, but I will take notes on like interactions between proteins. And so if I have this big like passage about how this protein activates this one and brings the retinol inside, which is then phosphorylated and then sent into this pathway, I'll just like do a quick sketch of like retinol, like draw a circle for a cell, retinol enters the cell. And a lot of times looking at that figure is way easier than trying to read this paragraph. And so I feel a little bit like a 5-year-old at times where I'm like, give me a picture book and not like a word book, right? Like, and so just having this like quick sketch of like the stray 6 receptor binds retinol, brings it inside, and then it interacts with CREBP1 or LRAT, the luciferase retinal something transferase. And so like these, it's lecithin, not luciferase. That was gonna bother me. But like that's a really complex thing. But if I just do a quick sketch and I say like retinol binds stray 6, and then inside is CRBP and LRAT, and they like take it and do stuff with it. And those like that's like a really easy image for me to read rather than like trying to read and dissect the passage. And I think that's useful, especially when you're reviewing, if you're like going back and looking at a passage, or if you're practicing with passages kind of upfront. I think that doing some things like that and like doing sketches to just help you understand what is this passage actually telling me. The more of those you do, the easier it gets. And so maybe later on you won't need to draw like a thing to understand how these things are all interacting. But it's not a bad idea at first to just kind of like check and make sure that you understand that idea of like understanding at the very least in hindsight, because all these passages there's like a certain limit to the sorts of information the MCAT can test. It never feels like it at the beginning, but later on, as you like start to go through more and more stuff, you're going to realize like, I've seen a passage kind of like this before. Like, oh, they're using the same technique that I saw in that passage like a long time ago. And like all of a sudden you're going to know enough, and these are going to be easy enough for you to read that you'll be able to like this just makes sense. Right? I just like read this was the 50th passage I've done. This just makes sense. The first like 30 made no sense, but this one just makes sense. It clicks. Like obviously I know what they're trying to do because I understand what they're saying, but that's not the default position for most people. And so that takes a lot of review and practice to get there.
Yeah, you should always make sure that for every passage you do, for every science passage that you tackle, like Phil said, you need to make sure that you understand it and how it was tested afterwards, right? So even if, and this is something that I've seen a lot of students do, and I think in part it's because it's really uncomfortable to sit through and work through really difficult passages. They'll say, well, I didn't know that, right? And then just move on to the next question. And they'll say, oh, that was content. I didn't know that. And just move on to the next question. When a lot of times, especially for these biochem passages, there's a lot of information embedded in the passage that even if it was a little bit of content that you didn't remember, you still could have answered it based off of the information in the passage. And so making sure that you're keeping track of those types of questions is important. Just because something looks or feels like a pseudo-discrete doesn't mean that it really was, because there's information in the passage that helps you answer it. So that's one of the pros and cons of, I'd say, the biochem.
That's huge. Mm-hmm. Especially the further you go, the more you understand. There's a lot of times I'll read a question. I'm like working with a student and there'll be something about like where is this protein found that is important for the infectivity of Ebola? And I'm like, all right, are we supposed to know this? And they're like, I don't know it. I don't think like are we supposed to know this? I'm like, no, like this is not something we're supposed to know, which means the answer is in the passage. And so you like go back and you look at the passage and it's like, well, like only one organelle was mentioned in the entire passage. So that's the answer, because like this is not something they're expecting you to know. So getting a good grip on like what stuff are you being held responsible for and what stuff are you not helps you understand like when to turn internal to like find the answer in your head, and when to go external, like where's the answer just somewhere in the passage, just go find it. But that also comes with exposure. And the more you see, the better. I do want to do like a quick thing. I actually think there's a lot of like differences between test prep companies, but the best resource for working on this is always the AAMC with especially their section bank. I love their section bank. It is very difficult and painful to get through, but if you can make it through the section bank, then you can handle any passage you want. That's why at Jack Westin, we just focus on the AAMC resources, because they're the people who write the actual test. And so we teach based off of what is going on there, rather than like what some chemistry professor thinks, how they think the MCAT is going to test you on something. And so sticking to AAMC materials is good. Obviously, we also have our like Jack Westin daily passages that we release that are also really good practice for wanting to deal with that, just like data interpretation stuff.
One last thought, because it came to mind as you were talking earlier. I don't know if you could see the visible jump.
Every once in a while, I see like your face do something like, all right, Azaii has something to add.
My face gets me in trouble a lot. So something that is also really important when you're going through the biochem section is always keep track of what organism type is being used in the experiment. Eukaryotes versus prokaryotes. It's such a basic difference in the sense that, it's a eukaryote versus a prokaryote, but there are so many questions that they can spin off of those differences, right? And the differences that come with that. And so I've seen so many students, brilliant students, who have so much content knowledge and ability to apply that knowledge, and then they'll miss questions consistently because they'll be thinking about, okay, well, let's say that you need to move something. You have something with a short half-life, right? And it needs to travel, and they're asking about how it's going to move within the cell, right? And they forget that we were working with a prokaryote, not a eukaryote. And something might mention the mitotic spindle, right? Something might mention, a particular organelle. And then you're like, well, wait a second. Prokaryotes, right, don't have membrane-bound organelles. They don't undergo mitosis. So they'll be drawn to answer choices that don't apply to the specific organism type, right, in the passage. So it feels super silly that I'm saying this, but I've seen it happen so many times that it's worth mentioning, and that's why I think I lit up like a Christmas tree when I thought about it.
Right.
But
especially because often the MCAT will have multiple things in the passage. Like here's a bacteria that we like put the gene in that's normally found in a mouse, but we put it in this bacteria, and they're asking me like, what's going on there? I'm like, it's a little bit different between the two. And that can cause a lot of issues. Or certain, like everyone just thinks anything small is probably a prokaryote, and like that, it's not the case. Like yeast, it's a one cell organism. It's a eukaryote. Parasites that like malaria is a parasite that like lives inside your red blood cells. That is a eukaryote. It's not a prokaryote. So just because it's small doesn't mean it's a prokaryote. You got to be careful, because I know that gets a lot of students as well.
Yeah, it's the devil's in the details, so to speak. But at the same time, right? Notice that yes, it's one detail that we mentioned, but it ties into these really big overarching concepts and differences. So when you come across something like, man, I just missed that small detail, ask yourself, okay, well, what are the big picture tie-ins with this? Because like we've mentioned, biochem, different than some of the other sections, right? In the sense that you have a lot of different moving parts. You have that for all of the sections, but you have a little bit more heavy, it's a heavier lean towards data interpretation. Those smaller ideas, or those smaller notes in the passage that relate to much larger ideas, become very important for the data interpretation, for the analysis of the experiment, whatever is happening in that biochem passage.
Yeah, that's like a super important thing. And like there's, we've been focusing a lot on the data interpretation, but there are just some topics that keep showing up over and over, like the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Amino acids, which is like the single highest yield thing. If you ever see an amino acid mentioned in the passage, there's going to be a question about it. Like there is definitely going to be, like, make sure to pay attention to that thing. There might be 2 questions about it. And so there are just certain things that are really high yield. The thing is, like we mentioned, that tends not to be the biggest challenge for a lot of students. And so the idea was talk about like what's going on with the challenges for each section. But I guess in a way that like learning that like that vast amount of like just details is a little bit of a challenge. I think just most students have gotten to the point, if they're taking the MCAT, they've learned how to incorporate facts. They've learned how to like pick up facts and like lists and things like that. But that is something that's super important, especially because bio is just so high yield. The number of chemistry and physics combined questions you're going to see on test day is about 35. The number of bio and biochem questions is 75. So you actually have more than double the amount of bio and biochemistry than you do chemistry and physics. And so like that's way higher yield. And so you want to make sure that you really know bio well, because it shows up in every section except for cars, and you need to be able to apply this everywhere. And so even though like a lot of the stuff we're talking about here is specifically about the biochem stuff, it really applies to other sections as well, because there's some crossover. That's just how the MCAT works. It's no longer the clear defined, like this is a chemistry passage, this is just bio, this is just orgo. Now everything's kind of integrated, and bio is the predominant thing that you're going to come across in each passage.
For sure. So we talked today about biochem. Last week we talked about chem phys. We have another section coming up. See if you can guess which one it is. Go ahead. Remember to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Let us know in the comments if you're on YouTube what strategy you found most helpful in our conversation that you think you might apply or that you're looking forward to applying, or any little tidbits. We love to hear from you guys. And then stay tuned for our next section next week.